Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to see real live faces in front of me this afternoon instead of just myself on a Zoom screen. So I thank you all for being here. 2.5 years. That's how long it's been since we've been able to gather together, and actually 3 years since our last luncheon in this beautiful space at the Memorial Art Gallery. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our luncheon conclusion of the 17th annual Reshaping Rochester lecture series. My name is Monica Reifenstein, and I'm the interim executive director here at the CDCR. This year's theme for our lecture series is the ideal city. Each year through our lecture series, the CDCR aims to open dialogue around urban planning, design strategies, and issues of equity that contribute to the revitalization of our region. We continue to be especially interested in how we can promote inclusion and equity through the way we think about and create space. Over the course of the series this year, we've discussed what it means to be ideal, explored cities and communities that might be categorized as ideal, and asked if and how our own community might become ideal. We've learned a lot these past few months from our speakers, everything from the ABCs of urbanism to discriminatory appraisal practices to food equity and to climate change just last month. But most of all, what we've learned is that the ideal city doesn't really exist, and it shouldn't. Ideal means different things to different people and should be an evolving concept. One of our speakers this year, Dr. Samina Raja, chose to reframe the ideal city as the striving city. She feared that if we saw ideal as a destination instead of a journey, we wouldn't continue to strive to meet the needs of our community, which is, of course, what we need to do. That said, let me tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do at the Design Center. The Community Design Center of Rochester was founded in 2003, which means we're celebrating nearly 2 decades of service in the greater Rochester region. At the Design Center, we promote the creation of vibrant, equitable, and resilient communities by engaging, educating, and empowering stakeholders in crafting purposeful design. I'd like to introduce our board members, some of whom you will see in the audience today. Starting with our executive committee, we have Monica McCullough, Bill Price, Stephanie Annunziata, and Vanessa Villeneuve. Moving on to our at-large members, we have Howard Decker, who is currently out of the country in Rome. Jealous. Jean Dupre, Eugenio Marlin, Michael Pratico, Pamela Reese-Smith, Miriam Jacob, and Tanya Zweilin. I thank all of you for your commitment, guidance, and support. The work that we do wouldn't be possible without the support of organizations and individuals in our community. The RACF, the Rochester Area Community Foundation, is one of those organizations, and we truly treasure their support, financial and otherwise. I'd like to welcome Jennifer Leonard, the Foundation's president and CEO, to say a few words.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Monica, and thank you all of you for coming today, and I'll echo Monica's delight at being together in this beautiful space and being together so we can talk and touch and feel like part of a community again that is not just virtual. With apologies to the people who see this as a live stream, right? This is...
Well, no. The only live stream is our speaker.
The only live stream is our speaker. So, the Community Foundation has been proud to support the Community Design Center of Rochester over a period of some 18 years, which I think is 1 year longer than NISCA, if I was following the... yes, I win. We win. As a foundation created by and for the greater Rochester region, we believe in the need to understand and plan our public realm, including the buildings, parks, transportation systems that are part of our urban furniture. The Community Design Center Lecture Series has brought us tremendous speakers, like our guest today, from across the country to share wisdom on how we might organize for an increasingly dynamic and equitable city. The speakers have met with representatives from the city of Rochester and others influential in shaping this living space that we all share. As an advocate and as the organizer of Design Charrettes, CDCR has weighed in on projects from the East Avenue Wegmans to the Plymouth Exchange or Plex neighborhood, to the future of the Inner Loop, and you are seeing it happen in front of you, to Wayne County, and so many more engaging neighbors, policymakers, and design professionals in envisioning a more engaging and often more beautiful future. And there's been much more in the past, but we're looking forward to what is possible together in the future. I'm so glad that there are so many of you gathered here today because you recognize the importance that when CDCR succeeds, we all benefit. Thank you again for coming today, and thanks and congratulations to CDCR for a successful 2022 Reshaping Rochester series and annual luncheon. Thanks, Monica.
Thank you, Jennifer, and congratulations on your upcoming retirement. You've had an immeasurable impact on the community and our organization. We also gratefully acknowledge the ESL Charitable Foundation for their sustaining generosity and support of the lecture series at the gold level. Special thanks to our exclusive media sponsor, WXXI, AAA Rochester for sponsoring our professional development credits, and Hedison Artisan Chocolates for providing very tasty gifts to all of our featured speakers. I would also like to recognize and thank the New York State Council on the Arts, who has been a strong supporter for 17 years, as Jennifer pointed out. And we also appreciate the support of individuals in our community. Our circle of friends, in particular, is made up of people and businesses who have donated to our organization for operational support. A big thank you goes out to everyone you see on this list, and we extend an invitation to any of you who value the work of the Design Center to please join our circle. And there's a special QR code on the back of your program to do that. I would also like to recognize all those that have made today's event in particular possible. First, thank you to the Memorial Art Gallery's events team and Brown Hound Catering for providing a beautiful venue and delicious food. And special thanks to all those working behind the scenes, our lecture series planning committee, and particularly Tricia and Kelly at Marshall Partners, who have been a great support this year. As well as Mike Besaw at Highland Media Services, who is making all of the magic happen with the AV technological needs and bringing in our speaker virtually, and all of our volunteers as well, who are listed on the screen. Thank you all. Shout out to today's contributing sponsors, hello out there, and our table sponsors. Each year, we designate one of our lectures as the annual Roger Brown Lecture, and this year, that is today. Roger is the CDCR's founding father, a past board member, and longtime lecture committee member. Roger, I'm so glad that you can be with us today. Hello, Roger. You've been a great support to me and the organization over the years. We really appreciate your guidance and friendship. Okay, and before we get into the official presentation, I do have some continuing education boxes to check. This presentation has been approved for both AICP CM credits and AIA HSW credits. If you'd like credit for today's event and didn't sign in on your way in, you can do so on your way out today. Here is the AICP information, and this is the information for AIA credits. A brief description of the course content, and learning objectives resulting from today's program. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's featured speaker, Anna Muessig. Anna Muessig is a director at Gehl, where she specializes in delivering strategies, plans, and insights that center people and their health, happiness, and joy in the city transformation process. Anna has worked with Gehl for nearly a decade, building its practice with cities in the United States and around the world through innovative public realm action plans, evidence-based storytelling, mobility strategies, and creative engagement processes. Recent projects include the redesign of San Francisco's Civic Center, helping Google build its global placemaking program for its campuses, designing the interface between micromobility and a sense of place with Lyft, and leading a robust community engagement process to redevelop a car-oriented mall as a mixed-use, transit-connected community. Before joining Gehl, Anna was a public art curator and producer. She holds a master's in city planning from MIT. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Anna Muessig to the virtual stage as she takes us through a presentation called The Public Realm as Social Infrastructure, an Introduction to Human-Scale Design.
Thank you, Monica. I want to make sure you all can hear me and see me. Can you?
You're looking good, Anna.
Okay, great. Well, I'll introduce myself here to you, and then I'll go into my presentation. And I think we've decided that we're going to hide my camera so that you can see the presentation well. But thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this distinguished lecture series. Thank you, Monica. Thank you to Maria, who originally invited me actually before the pandemic, to the speakers committee, to Bill, to Roger Brown. Thank you for this lecture. It's an honor to be here. My name is Anna Muessig. I'm a director at Gehl, as Monica mentioned, and I have to tell you, I'm really sad that I can't be there with you in person. I heard a little bit of chatter as you were all milling in, like it's nice to see you, haven't seen you in a while, and I just know how sweet it is to be in the company of friends and colleagues. So hopefully I'll give you some interesting fodder to discuss around your table. I want to focus my remarks today on the ideal city, and I want to take slight issue with what Monica shared and what some of your recent speakers have shared, which is, does the ideal city really exist? And I want to put forward that actually, indeed, it might exist, but it may not all exist in one place. I really like the sort of futurist writing of William Gibson. He writes, "The future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed." I hope to share with you some ideas, some principles, and some examples from the work of Gehl from around the world to show that there are things that we can certainly aspire to that are absolutely ideal. They may not yet exist in Rochester, but they could. So I'll share some thoughts about the ideal city. I personally have been thinking a lot about the idea of how we value the public realm. I'm going to focus my remarks on the public realm and public life, and something that has been really inspiring to me about the national conversation about how we value these things that we care about has been this conversation of infrastructure. What constitutes infrastructure, and how might we value infrastructure that supports public life? And then finally, I'll show you a couple of examples from the Gehl portfolio, the work that we've been doing that you can chew on as you chew your food. So without further ado, thank you so much. I look forward to our conversation. I'm going to keep my remarks relatively brief so we can have a conversation afterwards. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully I can get a little bit of feedback and you can let me know if you can see what I see. Okay, so I'll keep my camera on, and I think it's been removed for me. So hopefully, I think you can see the photos of my colleagues and I. So I'm sorry, did someone say something? Great, I'll take that as a yes. So thanks again for the invitation. I join you from Gehl. Gehl is a small urban design studio based in Copenhagen with offices in New York and San Francisco. Let me get my pointer so you can see where I am. Here I am. We're a small studio, and we're really focused on putting people first. we're building off of the 40-year legacy of Gehl. Some of you may know Jan. Those of you who don't, Jan is sort of the European equivalent of Jane Jacobs. He was an activist trained originally as an architect. Jane Jacobs, in our American context, was trained as a journalist. She used words and advocacy to stop Robert Moses and all sorts of modernist ideals about efficiency, as the greatest value of cities. Jan similarly was an activist, but he was trained as an architect, and he used his training to help the city of Copenhagen and then cities around the world to focus on how people experience space. We still use Copenhagen as our laboratory for exploring some of these ideas. Our studios are in 3 cities. I sit in San Francisco, but I work closely with my colleagues in Copenhagen and in New York City. We're very lucky to have shaped profoundly all the cities in which we work. In Copenhagen, Jan's work through his ethnographic research, which I'll share a bit about today, helped turn a city which was absolutely choked by cars. It has all of the same challenges that as American cities did back in the 1950s and still do today. His work helped to really transformed the public realm network in Copenhagen. And now you see it, topping the charts in terms of livable cities and cities to visit. People go there just to see the cycling infrastructure on vacation. Maybe that's some of you. We've continued to shape that city. In New York City, we were really proud to work with the Bloomberg administration to think about what the future of the public realm network looks like in New York. And probably the most well-known effort from that work was to rethink Times Square from a place that was given over mostly to vehicles, to people in cars, and through a series of experiments using data about how people use space, we put the square back in Times Square. So now if you go, it's actually a wonderful platform for human experience as opposed to a gauntlet to run through. And it doesn't take away from what Times Square is as a place. It really just embraces it as a wonderful place of hustle and bustle. And the work that we did to evaluate how this pilot that you see here in the middle was functioning really helped that be possible. So we continue to have a presence in New York. And I sit in San Francisco. I worked with an organization called Rebar, which started something back in 2005 called Parking Day. It started as a public art project called Parking. My colleagues Blaine and JB and their colleague Matthew went out to a parking space and decided to feed the meter with quarters, like you do. But instead of putting a sleeping car in the parking space, they just decided to do something else. They put a park there, a pop-up park. And what a lot of people don't know, I was sharing on Monday when I spoke with some of you who are maybe in the audience, some community leaders in Rochester. This was actually sort of in the ether. There was really a zeitgeist at the time in the Soma district of San Francisco to rethink the streets. Rebar was one of many groups who were experimenting with how to do this. But we did it with the sort of stickiest perspective. So it really grew. It grew into one of the nation's first parklet programs. This is one of the parklets that Rebar designed. As you can see, it's a public parklet. It's supporting a private business, but it's part of the public realm. We helped shape San Francisco's permit program, which started in 2009. Many cities now, because of the pandemic, are now just starting to explore parklet programs. This was really the beginning of that wave. And it's really sparked just an incredible movement. Now we have Parking Day as a global phenomenon, not just a one-off art installation. And indeed, when you Google parklet, you see hundreds and hundreds, thousands of examples of innovative ways that people are reclaiming streets for people, for the ways that communities want to use them. That ethos of rethinking how our streets serve us as communities is very, very core to the work that I do, the work that we do at Gehl, especially in the San Francisco office. We're small but mighty. We're a tiny firm based in 3 places, but we worked in over 300 cities around the world. And the thing that propels our work is a very, very simple premise, which is that you need to put life ahead of all the other priorities in the city transformation process. We're all trained as architects. Many of us have a background in social sciences or research, and we certainly get into buildings. We absolutely understand public space. We do design public space. But before we get to buildings, before we get to space, we really think about the life that we want to create in a city. We understand how people are using space and use that to craft the public spaces that we want to see. And then finally, we get into building design standards, master planning, and all the details of city transformation in terms of designing buildings. But we always go back to what type of life do we want to see? And I'll show you some examples of that. When we talk about public life, I think it's important just to sort of understand what we mean in terms of that diversity of public life and why it's important. So to us, public life, it's certainly civic. It's what we do when we get together and express what's happening in society. We get together with our neighbors, people who we know, people who we don't know. But it's also sort of banal. It's what we do every day. This is a project that we designed, the 30th Street Station in Philadelphia. It's what we do when we're waiting for the train. Public life is planned events. It's important to think about big gathering moments where you can sort of have this sort of collective effervescence where people come together and really feel like they're part of something. I think when we talk about public life, we're mostly talking about this, big planned events. And that's super important. It's something that we're all excited to get back into as we look forward to the sort of endemic phase of the pandemic. But it's also every day. It's going to the grocery store. It's picking your kids up from work. And it's also spontaneous, not just planned events, but like all the wonderful things that have happened throughout the pandemic, moments when we just can't contain ourselves. We have to get into the streets. We have to see each other, and we just rejoice in seeing each other's presence. I think we all felt that during the pandemic. It's what you love to do. It's sort of finding the sweet summertime spot on the bridge in a cool summertime afternoon. But it's also what you have to do. It's walking to work and all of that. It's for the young. This is my daughter at the San Francisco Artist Soapbox Derby, taking in one of her first moments of public life. But it's also for the older, people of a certain age. This is the skate and spot in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. It's for all ages of life. So public life, which is this thing that we study, we care for, we look for all over the world, it is what people create together when they're invited to discover, participate, connect, shape, and share experiences. So it's all of those things that I described, and it's actually, we believe, at the core of cities' greatest opportunities and challenges. Many of you in the audience are focused on mobility, mode shift. How do we get people out of their cars into more sustainable forms of transit? That's about making walking to work, taking transit to work, even more attractive than driving. That's about public life. It's about equity and access. It's about having every person feel invited to participate in public life, to spend time in their public spaces and feel safe doing so. That's about public life. It's about democracy, empathy, trust, understanding that our societies are different. We can't do that unless we see each other in public space. I want to key into a couple. We've done a little bit of research just to emphasize the importance of this around health in particular. Studies have been done showing that people living in neighborhoods with good urban design, meaning intersection density, parks, public transit, they report up to 89 more minutes per week of physical activity. So actually, if you look at how many minutes of physical activity we need more of in order to prevent an obesity epidemic, which we do have in our communities, there are many things that can contribute to that. Good urban design, great public life, people being invited to spend time in their neighborhood public spaces is a big part of that. To key into another one around opportunity, economic impact, public space improvements, and in particular, protected bike lanes can result in increased business sales. 34% of cyclists made unplanned food or beverage purchases. This is from a great study from Transportation Alternatives in New York around a shopping study of folks who bike to work and bike around. There are numerous studies showing the economic impact of a great public realm and a public space that invites people to participate. So This is not just, big statistics on the national scale. We've all really felt this. We at Gehl did a big study at the beginning of the pandemic when we thought it was only going to be a couple of months, maybe weeks. We asked people how they were using public space during the pandemic, and we found that people needed it more than ever. They needed it for their mental health, their physical health, to run errands, to find distance from one another. We probably all recognize this pretty remarkable image of these circles painted 6 feet apart from each other. This is in Dolores Park near my house in San Francisco. The pandemic, I think, has really brought home how important the public realm is to our health and happiness. But unfortunately, change isn't necessarily coming. And while we have felt the urgency for safe, protected, and accessible public spaces, our leadership and the funding structures that flow from that haven't always kept up. This is a quote from, or a finding from the Menino Survey of Mayors, which is looking at, post-COVID, how is our public realm being valued by mayors, folks who shape the public realm? And the headline is, mayors expect residents will spend more time in outdoor public spaces, but few are using the pandemic as an opportunity to reimagine these areas. So there's a great understanding in our society that the public space and the public realm is essential to what we care for, but we're not necessarily valuing it and making improvements to emphasize and really realize the value of that opportunity. And that's something that I am really focused on and really want to have a discussion about. How should we value our public realm? Which do we value more? This image on the left probably looks familiar to you. It's from Rochester, a freeway that's in the process of being decommissioned and re-envisioned. And on the right, this is an image of Patricia's Green. This is a piece of the highway that actually fell down in an earthquake in San Francisco and was reclaimed by the neighborhood as a fantastic public space. This is like a before-after photo for what this piece of Rochester could be. Both are infrastructure I would value. And that's something that I'm really interested in talking about. So what is social infrastructure to us and how do we value it? As many of you are probably following Biden's quest and effort to pass an infrastructure bill, there was a social infrastructure bill that was being discussed alongside the physical infrastructure bill. So physical infrastructure, we're talking about roads and bridges and highways, all of those essential pieces of hard infrastructure, a lot of it related to mobility and utilities. But as Biden says, an investment in our human infrastructure is inextricably intertwined with other types of infrastructure. There's a writer named Eric Klinenberg who has written a lot about this topic. Actually, if you find this article, it's an op-ed, or actually a book review by Pete Buttigieg before he was the transportation secretary, where he talks about the key to happiness might be as simple as a library, a park, or actually a sidewalk. Eric describes social infrastructure as the physical conditions that determine whether social capital develops. As a public space designer, as an advocate for the value of the public realm, I'm really interested in this argumentation about how we value these humble yet extremely essential places. I'm interested in the intersection between physical infrastructure and social infrastructure, thinking about streets, sidewalks, parks, parklets, pieces of our public realm that are absolutely part of physical infrastructure, they're part of these big bills that need to be passed, but they do something that that we need in our society, that libraries do, the way that we value schools, rec centers, churches, and religious institutions. I believe, and I'm interested in having a conversation with all of you, that these important pieces of our public realm are just as important. And one more data point to really bring it home, when we think about the public realm, and when I read that headline from the Menino Survey of Mayors saying that mayors understand that the public realm is super important, but they're not necessarily interested in putting more investment into it, I want to challenge our civic leaders to think not only about public spaces, parks, parklets, formal public spaces, plazas, and so on, but also about the streets that connect us there. Many of you have maybe seen the statistic that streets make up, in most cities, more than 80% of our public open space. So parks, super important. They're about 20% of all of the public space in our cities. Streets make up a great preponderance of this space. So just to bring that home, how important streets are as part of the public realm network. So Monica, the speakers committee, and the topic of this series is the ideal city. And I thought it would be interesting, once sort of making this argument about the public realm as social infrastructure, how might we go about designing it? What are the component pieces? So here's my manifesto for the ideal city. I think the ideal city is human scale. It's designed with the most vulnerable people in mind. It makes everyday choices for the individual also the best for society, and it changes based on what's working. So I'm going to go through each of these 4 points and share with you some research insights and examples from Gehl's practice around the world. The first is human scale. What do we mean when we're talking about a human scaled city? Well, many of us have probably visited this space when we go to the movies. This is from Wakanda. Many of you probably were very excited to see this. I certainly was. I loved seeing human scale streets, transit integrated with the public realm, great access to nature, street wall that provides eyes on the street, tons of sensory stimulation every 4 seconds to keep people interested. This is what I want to see in my cities. We also see these places on vacation. We visit them in our free time, the precious days that we have with our family. We go to places with great places to eat, a place to rest and watch other people, seeing the world go by from a comfortable vantage point. So why is it that we don't experience these places in the cities that we live? Part of it, I'm sorry to say, is because of misguided design. And as a designer, I have absolutely witnessed and hopefully not been part of design that is a little bit presumptuous. We think that we know how people are going to use space. We think that this is the best way to lay out this piece of public realm. But in fact, people know better. Human beings are incredibly energy conserving. We don't want to walk the extra 20 seconds. We do want to cut the corners. And that's not a mistake that we're making. We're not being bad people. We are being humans. It's the design that actually needs to change. There's so many examples of this. And in our work, we always go out and observe how people are using space. And we come up with countless examples of the ways in which the public realm is not serving us as people. We developed some of these methods through Yan's early sketchbooks. And these are pictures from Yan. I know this is a somewhat small screen, but here at the bottom, there's actually a newspaper article in Italian. It says, "He looks like, but he is not, a beatnik." And it's a picture of Yan as a young man sitting on the edge of a piazza in Italy, observing this place that he went to go understand, that he thought had the greatest public life in the world. And he found some interesting things there. He sort of used all of his time that he spent there with his family to develop a couple of rules of thumb. Some of those are that, when we're in a public space, we want to find what he calls a little friend in a space, something that you can put your back to so that you can feel comfortable to observe others. This is the Campo di Siena, a really, really perfect public space. It's got a slight slope, so you have this classic prospect and refuge. You feel like you can see something, it's prospect, but you also have refuge, a sense of safety. We all have this natural inclination as human animals to find that sense of safety. We also see these really natural and universal social distances showing up all over the world. And I'll show you some examples of why we arrange ourselves as human beings in these really predictable ways. So the reason Yan went to Italy to study this public life is because he was trained as an architect, as maybe some of you are, and as much of our team is. And he was out there in the 1950s and 60s designing fantastic modernist buildings. The zeitgeist at the time was all about sort of high design, but for all people, demolishing old pieces of city and replacing these old pieces of city with big high rises with vast public spaces. And his wife, named Ingrid, asked him, Jan, do people actually enjoy these public spaces that you are designing? And Jan said, oh my God, I have no idea. And it was that question and his wife's background as a social psychiatrist and understanding space from a child's point of view that brought him to develop this methodology that we still use today to understand public spaces. So some of the rules of thumb that he developed and that we now understand to be true are that there are these critical human dimensions that we all share. We all see the world from about 170 centimeters, facing slightly down. This is a vestige of our development as human beings. We slightly look down. That means that the ground floor is the most important part of a building to us, not the cornice line, not necessarily the fenestration up at the third, fourth, fifth stories. It's actually the ground floor is the most important to us. We all experience cities at about the same walking speed, 5 miles per hour, and our senses are really important for us to feel safe. So take this street. This is in the Haight in San Francisco. It's got a really nice series of small building facades that you actually, if you're walking at a human pace, about 3 miles per hour, you hit a new facade about every 4 seconds. And that one, we need 1,000 stimuli per hour as human beings to feel safe in a place. Otherwise, we don't feel comfortable. And you've probably noticed that when you've walked along a big blank facade that you feel unsafe, probably because you don't see other people looking at you. You really want to get to the other side of that big blank facade. And it actually probably feels like it takes a lot longer to walk. So these types of human distances are really, really important to how we experience space and important to how we think about human scale. There's another one that's really important, which is around the social field of vision, designing spaces so that we encourage the type of social activity that we want to see in our cities. And one of the things that I often do is talk down developers, community members, and cities for making lots of really, really big public spaces. And the reason is, with a really, really big public space, all you can really tell is like someone's gender and their age. You're not really encouraged to meet them, greet them, look them in the eye. At about 164 feet, you start to see hair color, some personal characteristics. Actually, 115 feet is the perfect distance for great opera houses and theaters. It's a great vantage point to do some great people watching, but still the sort of public interaction, the public life that we might want to see isn't necessarily encouraged. At 66 feet, you can start to maintain a comfortable distance with strangers. At 33 feet, you can start to see facial expressions and emotions. At 16 feet, that's sort of where you might be at a market with someone. You can participate in the same activity as someone else without really intervening in their personal space. As you start to get closer at 7 feet, you're starting to have a really comfortable conversational distance. And at the really, really close scale, 18 inches, that's a really intimate and sensitive distance. We think about these spaces because so often we design big, big, big public spaces that are so blown out, we don't ever see each other. So this is San Francisco Civic Center. I worked with a really fantastic design team, CMG, to make a proposal for the redesign of this space. And one of the big challenges that we identified in studying the public life of this space is that while there may be many, many people in this space, there's not enough compression for them to see each other, to greet each other, to feel like they're in the same space together. Nor is there the presence of a landscape room or other physical barriers to create distance from people who we may not want to be super close to, but we can certainly share the same space. For those of you who have visited San Francisco, you know that there is a challenge with housing and people experiencing homelessness. when there's a single person in this space that's obviously experiencing homelessness, it often repels many other people from spending time there. And that's not necessarily the fault of the person who's encamped there with their belongings, but actually a fault of the public space design for creating little landscape rooms for them to feel comfortable, other people to feel comfortable. On the right, you're seeing a really different example. This is Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. Rittenhouse Square, along with other similar sort of classically designed public spaces, Bryant Park is another similar one, has lots and lots of little landscape rooms with edges and physical barriers without visual barriers. So you can really chop up the space in a way that lends itself to lots of little different personable interactions. This is the sort of intimate distance. So these images that we're showing at the very beginning, these are really important rules of thumb for us, not just sort of phenomenologically. We're interested as urban researchers what creates social life in spaces. But if we care about public spaces supporting social infrastructure, we need to create spaces where we're encouraged to come together in ways that are comfortable for us. And that's the human scale. One more example I'll show is oftentimes when we're making great investments in sustainability, for example, new transit lines or new housing, big, great LEED certified buildings, we're forgetting about the quality of the connections to those spaces. And this happens so often with transit spaces in the United States. We see transit too often as a piece of infrastructure, an operational challenge to solve, an engineering challenge, but we don't actually see it as a piece of the city. We don't see it as a piece of the public realm. And that's something that we work on a lot, making sure that these great investments in our cities also translate to great experiences at the ground floor. That was number one. The second part of the ideal city is designing with the most vulnerable in mind. And oftentimes people are asking us, how do you integrate equity in your work? What's your equity approach? And to that, I would say that actually equity is built into this ethnographic approach of understanding the world from the human scale. So this is a picture from probably the 1960s or 70s of a wheelchair at the edge of a curb. And I'm using this to illustrate the idea of the curb cut effect, which many of you might have heard of. There was a group of architects at Berkeley, at Cal, in their architecture program, and they all happened to be mobility impaired. So some of them were in wheelchairs, and they helped lead a movement, which then has translated into different what we now understand to be ADA requirements. They led a movement to help people see that while, yes, Berkeley had sidewalks and public realm, absolutely, it didn't have the necessary infrastructure to help people who were mobility impaired move around. And that's really, really critical for them to get around. But by seeing it from their perspective, it made the city more comfortable for everyone. So I have an 8-month-old child at home. I spent a lot of time in a stroller. I spend a lot of time in a stroller moving around. That curb cut is essential for me to get around. By seeing the world from the perspective of the most disadvantaged, we find new and better ways to make cities accessible to everybody. A project that we worked on that sort of brings this to life is a collaboration that we did with Spin. Spin is a scooter company. Not sure if it's in Rochester, maybe it is. We worked with a really fantastic team of design researchers from D Ford. It's a collaboration between IDEO and Ford Motor Company. Transform, which is a local mobility advocacy organization, and Tool Design, to think about what a equity program means for Spin. When we came into the program, we thought about equity as being just a discount program. We wanted to help people get discounted rides. But through this rigorous research methodology, working with communities, we actually changed our approach entirely. So this is probably going to be really small for all of you. I apologize for that. Here's a selection of the different methods that we use to help Spin redesign their equity program. We hired community advisors from the community to be in the design process with us to define the challenge and the opportunities, the design solutions. We did rider interviews, we did detailed site observations, we did an operations shadow with the folks who actually deploy the vehicles. We did expert interviews. We had a big rider survey for all the riders who participate in this SPIN Access, which is their low-income discount program. And then we did a really detailed analysis of where we find the spin scooters versus where they could make the biggest difference. We put all of this together in a series of prototypes that we then workshopped with communities. But the biggest thing that came out of this work was actually a new definition of the design opportunity. So like I said, we went into this program thinking we're going to design a better way for people to sign up for fare reduction. But actually, when we heard about the challenge from the people who had mobility challenges, who were in transit deserts, they told us actually their biggest challenge was that they didn't have price transparency. They could probably pay, but they didn't know if they were going to get hit with a big bill or a small bill based on how far they were going. They cared about reliable availability of vehicles more than they cared about the design of the scooter itself. So they didn't care if it had cool handlebars, great brakes, wide platform. They just cared if it was in their community to begin with. And that was a huge challenge from an operational perspective. So our community advisors in our process helped us surface that reliable availability was one of the most important design challenges that we faced. They also helped us understand that active inclusion, helping brand and market scooters as something that was essential mobility, not just a fun ride, was important for them. Of course, make it easy to enroll and have some low-tech redundancies. So we developed a number of different prototypes and some principles about how to develop equity in the spin scooter process. We developed a set of prototypes that we share. We have this website that we set up. It's called spinmobilityequity.com, and there's a little bit of a scroll here. I want to make sure that folks can still hear me. I just had something happen on my computer, but I think I'm connected. So if you can't hear me, let me know. So the third component of the ideal city, this manifesto for the ideal city, is that everyday choice for the individual is also the best for the society. And the best example of that is this. I would argue this is an image of ideal mobility. This is a picture of Copenhagen, no surprise. And like, boy, does it look blustery. It's snowing. Maybe it looks like Rochester in, I'm going to guess, like early February. And you see people driving, but many, many people are cycling. They're cycling to work. Even this brave fellow is on his phone with his little pram. This, to me, is the ideal city. Why is that? That's because people are choosing to ride their bicycles in this horrendous weather. So the reason that Copenhageners cycle, when you ask them, is not it's environmentally friendly. It's not that it's cheap or even that it's exercise. Copenhageners cycle because for them, it's quick, easy, and convenient. It is quick, easy, and convenient because of a series of really specific investments in the public realm. This image here is an image of a snowplow. The snowplow is plowing the bike lane actually before it's plowing the street. That is why people choose to cycle, because it's made easiest by the way that the city values that mode of transportation. The city feels emboldened to do this, not because they're radical activists, but because they have the data to back it up. This is an image of the pedestrianization of the core of Copenhagen over a series of years. You're seeing a couple of spaces pedestrianized, then more and more 20 years later, and then even more a decade later. And the bar chart on the right is showing the increase in people using those spaces. So over time, the city of Copenhagen has slowly taken away parking spaces, something like 1 or 3% of parking spaces per year, and given that back over to people to use in different ways, either as public spaces, parklets, or a cycling infrastructure. And they are rewarded by these different investments, by the public life that they're seeing. Copenhagen has a super rigorous approach of evaluating the public realm. And it emboldens them to make these choices every day so that the everyday choice for the individuals is also the best for society. I think this is such an important piece of the ideal city. You can see it in a lot of different ways, not just in the way that Copenhagen plows its bike lane, but here on the right, you're seeing a super awesome stop bar. It's a place to put your hand and your foot while you're waiting for the light so you can push off even faster when you're starting. Or on the left, you're seeing a garbage can that's especially designed for people to throw trash away while they're cycling. And here at the top is folks riding side by side, maybe a family. Copenhagen has actually started their sort of so far down the path of evaluation, they now evaluate how many people are holding a conversation while cycling side by side. So that means that they've widened their bike lanes so that folks can ride side by side going one way. And they know that in order to compete with families having that special time in the car, for many of you, and it's a very American tradition to have that sort of special family time to connect before and after kid drop off, to connect about the day and sort of be in one space together as a family. For some people, it's the only time that they're together as a family every day. The city of Copenhagen knows that that's really valuable and precious time. And so they measure what they care about. They're measuring how people are interacting with each other socially in the bike lanes. And they use that to embolden more and more investments in the public life that they want to see. Finally, it's really hard to say what is the ideal city, of course. And I've tried to lay out a couple of principles around human scale, approach around valuing the most vulnerable, making the everyday choice also the best for the society. But being flexible is maybe the most important. And working with communities to make that something that is community-led it pays dividends. So I mentioned that at the beginning of the pandemic, we did a big survey asking people how they use public spaces. We actually partnered with the Knight Foundation to do an even more in-depth process to understand how communities were using their public spaces in COVID and beyond with a specific equity approach. We found a lot of really fantastic things about how to design spaces with communities in mind, and you're welcome to find this report. I can put a link, actually you're not in the chat, I can send it around afterwards and you can find it on your own. But one of the interesting things is that spaces that were adapted to local needs, meaning communities were involved in defining the program, involved in defining the design, those spaces that were designed with communities in mind fostered more equitable access and greater resilience during the pandemic. So not only were those spaces that were designed with communities in the process, were they better used by those communities, but they were also more resilient, meaning they had businesses that were more successful in those spaces and they were better used over time. So we find this over and over in our work. So this is the manifesto. Would love to hear your thoughts on the idea that an ideal city is human scale, designed with the most vulnerable in mind, makes the everyday choice for the individual also the best for the society, and changes based on what's working. Some of how we get there, I think I've shown some of those examples in the presentation. Those of you who know Gehl's work know that we start with this ethnographic observation. So from the old creaky, sepia-toned photos of Yan to the present day, we have been doing these studies. This is an image from our downtown public life study of Vancouver. We put out a very noble volunteer effort of over 200 people fanning out around downtown Vancouver, studying public life in order to understand what's working and what's not. We actually have an app, from pen and paper to the 21st century. We have an app that actually helps us study public life to collect data, but also compare it with this global database, which allows us to do some benchmarking, which is really fantastic. We use some tools like the 12 urban quality criteria to assess urban quality from a public space design perspective. It's what allows us to understand why a facade is working or not, and why a public space might be well used or not. So I have three examples, brief examples, of how we use these methodologies to shape public space design. The first is an example that maybe some of you know from Pittsburgh. There's two great public spaces. One is Mellon Square, really well designed, very fine materials, won a lot of awards in terms of its design. The other is Market Square, very modest space. For every one person spending time in Mellon Square, there are about 6 or 7 people spending time in Market Square. Why is that? Part of it's because there are more public seats and cafe seats in Market Square, and it's ringed with a series of businesses that just bring life to the place. So yes, it's not the nicest design. It's a really modest space. It's actually quite small, but it's designed in such a way, it's got that invitation for public life that it just feeds on itself. People go there to see other people. Bringing this public life data to downtown Pittsburgh has helped them make different investments in how they value their public spaces. The second finding or example is understanding the impact of design on behavior. So we're really interested in studying the public life of transit stops in particular. This is a bus stop in Baltimore on the left. On the right is what I think is one of the greatest bus stops in the world. This is also from downtown Pittsburgh. So one of the findings that we're really interested in is that when you have a transit stop that has amenities, so benches, shelter, real-time departure time, even just public art, people report having significantly shorter wait times. And why is that important? That's important because one of the biggest barriers for people taking transit is that they think it's going to take too long, or they hate waiting. Great designing transit stations as an integrated part of the public realm helps us make mode shift that much more attractive. So this is a great example of using data, ethnographic data about how people use space to tailor our investments. The third and final one has more to do with place attachment. Here's a couple of images from a project that I worked on in Washington, D.C., where we worked with the community to define and to design a better bus stop. We called it Super Stops. And there are lots of great findings from this project. Happy to talk about it more. But one of the most interesting things that we found is that this is a neighborhood that has some challenges with disinvestment, some challenges with crime. It's east of the river in Washington, D.C. We found that after this sort of prototyping effort was complete, so as people were part of defining what the bus stop should look like, they actually helped build it themselves, more people felt strongly positive about their neighborhood. So we're really interested in place attachment, how people connect to place, they feel a place is theirs, they feel they belong. That sparks all sorts of other valuable things in our cities, like participation in the public process, even property values. It was very interesting to us to find that even this modest exercise of asking people what they want from their bus stop fostered place attachment. So another example about how we use data about what we care about to advocate for a great public realm. And finally, I just want to share, I know sometimes talking about the ideal city, bringing a manifesto, it's a manifesto for a reason, because it's hard. The public realm has so many different stakeholders taking care of it. There's public safety that are caring for the life safety of people. There's habitat, people looking out for trees in our urban ecosystems. Parks Department, mobility operators, departments of public works. One of the challenges we always see is that we're bringing manifestos, a big, bold perspective, and it gets sort of chopped up into all of these different component pieces, when actually the way that people experience space is as one complete experience. We like to think that these pieces of data, this ethnographic research, this data-informed design helps people sort of look at the same objective to try our best to shape the public realm, which is so important, to treat it as one holistic experience and really collaborate to make this public realm the great social infrastructure that it is, and that we really need in our societies. So I want to thank you for your attention. I'm really looking forward to conversation. Again, I really wish I could be there with you in person. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a moment. I'd love to take your comments about the presentation. I'm curious if the idea of social infrastructure and the importance of the public realm resonates to you, about what is going on in Rochester, what your ideal city looks like. And I'll just look forward to the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that presentation. Really appreciate you sharing all of that with us and technologically making it all happen. We're going to transition into an interactive Q&A now. So you'll see a stationary mic in the center of the room. Feel free to go up to that mic and with all of your questions, and Anna will be able to hear you, and she can actually see you as well, thanks to our tech guy, Mike. There's a camera positioned right in front, so keep that in mind. Yes, and I'll just pass it over to our Vice President and Lecture Series Committee Chair, Bill Price, who will be helping to moderate the conversation.
Thank you, Monica. Thanks, Anna. Appreciate your presentation and all the thoughts and kind of the insight into Gehl's methodology. We're open for questions or comments. Does anyone want to come up and ask Anna a question or make a statement? Please.
Sure. My name is Suzanne Mayer. I'm with Hinge Neighbors, and I asked, we were talking about zoning in Rochester and talking about land use and infrastructure. I talked a little bit to a city council person, and he said, I'm not going to vote for anything unless it has a density. So I was a little bit flabbergasted, so I would like to have you help me. How do I respond to that? And how do I then say, what do you mean? Just density, that's all you're going to vote for?
Did everybody
Interesting.
Did you hear that, Anna?
I think I did, yeah. So you're asking, okay. the council member is saying he won't vote for anything that doesn't have a high amount of density, is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective, and I can understand the flabbergastedness. There's a sea change happening right now that we're seeing all across the country around a desire for more housing and a desire for more density and all the things that brings. There has been a tide in the opposite direction in the past that was around sustaining quote unquote neighborhood character, ensuring that spaces and cities have a low density, with the idea that maybe it would curb traffic, that maybe it would curb some quote unquote big city problems that you might see. I'm seeing this right now actually in the project that I'm working on in San Francisco, that this sort of huge mall redevelopment, we're seeing it all over the country, that there's more of an emphasis now on density than there has been on sort of no density. And that is, and you probably have heard of like YIMBYs and NIMBYs. There's a strong YIMBY perspective of building more density in our communities. What I would say, and so I wouldn't be flabbergasted, I think it's happening everywhere. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Minneapolis has dealt with that by passing citywide ordinances around outlawing single family zoning. What I might focus on is what's the purpose of that density? We oftentimes ask people, there's lots of ways to think about density. There's height. So you might be thinking about creating a complete street wall that adds a sense of compression to a space. So I shared some thoughts about that related to the sort of social distances and why compression can actually be a valuable thing in cities. You may be seeing like big blown out streets, boulevards aren't super great for businesses on either side. Sometimes it's the smaller, finer grained streets that are more successful. So there could be something about density that's around the form. More likely than not, it's actually about dwelling unit density or population density. And to some people, that's really exciting because they want to get ahead of some big city problems, which I can't recommend, like having a multi-decade housing crisis like we're dealing with in San Francisco. The Bay Area has underbuilt housing for several decades, and as a result, the housing stock that we do have is highly overvalued. We need to build more. We need more density in order to get ahead of or dig ourselves out of this hole. There are other communities, maybe Rochester is one, that wants to avoid that. I know Minneapolis is looking at places like San Francisco and seeing a future that they don't necessarily want in terms of housing crises and things like that. But density can be a scary word for some people. Housing density can be something that might feel like it brings traffic. It might be a change in quality of life. And that's something that we often think about is how to make density something that is exciting to people. Density might bring traffic, but it also brings active and engaged public spaces. If you're looking for people to be walking around your downtown, bringing people to live there is a great way to do it. So happy to talk more about density. But I'll say talking about not just the design qualities, but the public life that you think that density might create is one way to have a conversation around shared values, instead of just talking about the sort of form outcome of a development. Happy to take a follow-up question on that one.
Thank you. Richard.
Just last night, our city council approved a budget which includes a tremendous amount of money for shade trees, street trees, to make the public realm a place where people will want to walk and congregate in the poorer neighborhoods. That's been neglected for decades, maybe for 100 years, because nobody maintains the trees, the kids break off the branches, they die, and there's streets without a single street tree left. What is your advice on how the poor neighborhoods can be retreed to involve the community so that they will respect the trees and help them and water them and not climb on them and break the branches before they're grown, et cetera, et cetera. That's what the legacy is from years and years of an unimaginative way of planting our streets.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard, for the question. I have to say, I'm happy to hear that I'm happy to hear about yet another example of putting your money where your mouth is in terms of equity investments. So we're seeing this all over the country. In Minneapolis, where I'm from, they've recently passed a capital budget, I think it was a couple of years ago, where they explicitly put more capital dollars into parks that had been undervalued over time or underinvested in over time, with an explicit equity approach. So it's not only the parks where the folks who are, able to come to the public meetings and shout the loudest. It's not just those parks that are getting the investment, but it's parks that have been historically underinvested in, and in parks and in neighborhoods where that public space might be even more valuable. Another example where we see valuing, orienting capital budgets, aligning capital budgets with an equity approach is in the city the city I used to live in Oakland, in the East Bay. The Oakland Department of Transportation, led by Ryan Russo, formerly of the New York City DOT, he actually aligned the city's repaving program, so the street repaving program, with equity goals. So that meant that some neighborhoods who absolutely needed to have their potholes filled, but didn't, because they weren't necessarily the neighborhoods that needed it the most. It was the neighborhoods that had the sort of biggest equity needs that got that repaving dollar. So to your question about, investing in quote unquote poorer neighborhoods, in terms of street trees, I commend that choice. Without knowing the context, it seems like it's a great direction. To your explicit question about how to ensure that those trees are respected or maintained properly, I mean, it's always a challenge with new trees. I won't speculate about what is actually we're seeing. I would go out and actually maybe observe. So sometimes when we see things in terms of public life or how people are using public spaces that we question, we go out there and observe. You might find that there are folks who are playing on the trees. Maybe it's because there's not a lot of other quality places to play. That's something that we've collaborated with Kaboom on a lot. And maybe that that nonprofit that maybe they're doing interesting things in Rochester as well. It's important for kids to be able to play in the streets. Trees, if they're mature, are great places to play, but not if they're going to be broken. So I would maybe put the question back on you. Is there an unmet need for physical activity that's not being met in other ways from the public realm that, don't take it out on the trees or that investment, or don't take it out on the kids either, if there's another way to meet their need?
Molly.
Thank you.
So just going back to the topic of housing, we talked about the need for more housing, and you were speaking about density. I think one of the things that we've started to look at, right, are incremental increases in terms of things like accessory dwelling units. And knowing that in California, that's been given sort of the green light, I'm just interested in what you've seen in San Francisco with respect to how that's moving forward. What maybe some of the things people were hesitant about that have worked out really well, like the YIMBY versus NIMBY sort of experience.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Super interesting. Yes, ADU zoning is a great way to sort of incrementally add infill housing. We've seen it be successful all over the country. I actually can't speak in a lot of detail about what I've seen in terms of policy. Mostly what we've been working on it with our master planning team is actually building new ground up multi-use, multi-function buildings, mixed use master plans. I know that ADUs, it's a question I'm not super prepared for, so apologies for that, but I've seen successful programs. I think that the fear of ADUs has been greatly overblown. Fear of more traffic, fear of more neighbors. One of the things that I really like in the Minneapolis context is, their YIMBY group is called Neighbors for More Neighbors. It's not neighbors for more density. It's not neighbors for more stories. It's neighbors for more neighbors. Inviting more people into our communities as something that's a community good. So I'll keep thinking about that ADU question if anything else comes to me, but I have seen it be successfully deployed elsewhere in the country.
I just need to add a little more to the question about the trees because it's really bugging me. Poverty has its own issues, and when you live in poverty and you go down some of the streets that we go down, the last thing on your mind is a tree. That said, it doesn't mean that we don't care about trees. I grew up in one of those neighborhoods, Peck and Goodman, for those of you who are from Rochester. We didn't have trees. We were trying to survive to make sure that we could pay the rent, that we could pay the next bill. But it doesn't mean they don't care. If we could somehow partner to make sure that, and this is what I do for the city, neighborhood service centers, that we get the calls, that we know that there's a tree that came down or a branch, so we can respond to it as a municipality. I know that we're all in, but to say that these trees are not being taken care of in poor neighborhoods, it's not because we don't care, and I want to make sure I note that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the statement. It sounds like that's an important statement to get out into this group. I will say, for those of you who are challenged with this issue or thinking about this issue, there's lots of great ways to involve communities in improving the public realm. Philadelphia has a program of block captains, getting people involved as block captains to care for and steward the public space, not as a volunteer effort, but that is something that is compensated, can be a great way to go, and a great way to sort of build buy-in. Again, in neighborhoods where people are working in order to make their lives work, that's not always an option. But if it's something that the city values, the city's made an investment in a mature tree canopy, stewardship is so often something that is missing in the public realm. So this is something that comes up on, big infrastructure projects as well as quote unquote social infrastructure projects or projects in the public realm. We have a big problem in our nation of putting in more bridges than we can maintain, more highways than we can maintain. And those of you who have been involved in the Interloop project probably know this very, very well. The same goes for tree canopy. If we are investing in something that we value, we need to also have a maintenance program, stewardship programs to make it work. So for those of you who are challenged with tree stewardship, that's a great program to value. And there's lots of great examples from all over the country about making that work and using it as an enrichment opportunity, an employment opportunity, and a way to further invest in disadvantaged communities.
Hi, I'm an undergraduate student at the U of R, and it seems the more that I learn about urbanism as an issue, it seems to me that it's more of a political issue. We know what to do with physical infrastructure. I mean, if you look towards Amsterdam, we know, like you've been saying, about this public infrastructure, investing in streets, but then we see, for example, in New York City, we can't even get congestion pricing within a 5-year timeline. So do you have any advice on what specifically we should be pushing for on like a political level to get fundamental change on maybe funding structures? It's just something that I've been struggling with recently, but thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for making urbanism the focus of your study. I do not have your answer. I hope that you can be on the stage in some number of years to answer that question. It is the question of the hour. I will refer to my previous talking points that, it's not actually a design problem, people. I'm really sorry to say, I'm an urban designer, and I'm telling you, it's not just a design problem. The design is the art, it's the beauty, it's the joy in this work. And for those of you who do urban transformation work, you know that there is joy to create and joy to be had and just wonderful experiences in design. But sadly, it's more often a political problem. And I would maybe make a nuanced point to your very important point, is that it's sometimes a communications problem. So I focus my remarks on the idea of social infrastructure, not because it's a new tagline that I want people to learn, but because I think it's a way to invest in the public realm and in good urbanism that aligns it with stuff that we do value as a society. We do put lots of money into roads and bridges and highways. And as you know, in Rochester, from this program to depave or change parts of an interstate, sometimes those are not the greatest investments, and we can make better investments in different types of infrastructure. So I agree with you, it's a political problem. It's also a communications problem, and that's why I'm bringing some conversation here around framing the public realm as social infrastructure and using data to hold up right next to all that data about how we use highways, for example. So we've got lots of information about level of service, for example, in highways, and all the traffic engineers, probably you in the audience, know exactly how to understand whether or not we should add a new lane to a highway, for example. We need to have the data right next to it about the value of taking away that lane and the value that taking away that lane would actually give back to society. So I hope you, person from U of R, work on something like that and come back and share your findings with us in a few years.
Thank you. Anyone else care to ask a question? Before I let Monica wrap up, Anna, if you can hear me, I just wanted to ask one more question. Some of your examples, being Copenhagen, New York, San Francisco, are cities with great density already. Rochester and some of the Rust Belt cities across the North and the Midwest experienced some out-migration to the suburbs, both residential and businesses. But now we're seeing kind of a renaissance where boomers and millennials are kind of coming back to urban areas for the quality of life aspects. If you could kind of highlight maybe one or two things that we could do, we're probably not going to get to that 4-second rule that you outlined, but if we could get to, interest in the public realm, maybe not every 4 seconds, but maybe within these 1/4 and 1/8 mile walking distances, what are some of the things that you would focus on in the near term?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Thanks for the question. It's a question that's close to my heart as well. Yes, I live in San Francisco and I work in some big cities, and it's fun to share the big picture examples, but I'm from Minneapolis, my partner's from Baltimore, shrinking cities. It's a really important American challenge, and it's something that we do think about. Pittsburgh, I think, a city that we've worked extensively in, has been challenged with some similar issues. And one of the pilots that we led there was about connecting great places. So yes, you're not going to have an amazing public realm network tomorrow, but you can connect two places together with a really comfortable walking experience or a great biking experience. And just connecting two nodes could be enough. Starting from a place of strength is always the best way. And, it doesn't have to be like bustling Bryant Park, like a great movie night with 1,000 people there. No, it's, the quality of that experience. As I referenced with the Knight Foundation work, having people be part of that experience in terms of defining it themselves, being part of the change process, builds place attachment, that builds a sense of investment in place. So that's something that I would emphasize, involving people in the process, starting with the areas of strength and just connecting one or two spaces and right sizing those spaces so that they'll feel successful to the people that are there. And not to be a broken record, but evaluating how you're doing, always understanding what you're measuring for. So if you if you care for people actually using the bike lane that you created, or people using the bike lane are men, women, and families, that's something that it's always good to understand, that you're inviting all types of people to the investments that you're making and being nimble enough to change over time.
Thank you. We do have one more question. Please, come on up.
Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm also a student at the U of R. I just wanted to ask a question that kind of touched upon something you mentioned earlier about how it's not always about the design. That's the art. That is the structure, right? But it can't be the end-all, be-all of kind of, bringing some things that we want to bring into fruition. And I think, especially in the United States, right, you have a perspective of design that is global, and in other countries, they seem to not have the same issues with violence being associated with urbanism, and like the United States specifically dealing with this problem by investing in police forces. And Rochester is no different from, that stereotype. And, talking about all the things that we want, trees are not going to solve some of issues like violence or homelessness. Police in and of themselves are similar in the way that they're treating a symptom rather than addressing the root cause of issues. And I think that is the beauty of design, that it could be used to provide things that would address the causes. Housing in and of itself would address a lot of public safety or public health concerns. Even outside of my dorm every night, like I hear homeless or unhoused persons, walking in the middle of the street, approaching cars, moving cars, asking like, can I please have some money, so I can have something to eat. There's obviously, this should not be happening in a country that has as much money, resources as the US does. So I guess my question in a more concise manner is, why is the United States making this mistake when other countries, I imagine, that you've worked with who are similar GDP, education levels, whatever metric you want to compare, they don't seem to make the same mistake in addressing these public safety, public health issues?
Wow, thank you for the question. And I appreciate the passion. I'm glad you're in this line of study, and I can't wait to see what you do with it. I can't answer that question. I will say that we have done a fair amount of work around homelessness in the public realm, and I appreciate what you're bringing to the question, which is this understanding the complexity between design and all sorts of other forces on the built environment, like public safety. We did a project with Spur, which is a nonprofit in the Bay Area that's sort of like our urbanist nonprofit. You can look it up. It's called Coexistence in Public Space. And it was a project to lead conversations around public safety and in spaces that experience homelessness. is a big issue in San Francisco. It's a very big issue in San Jose, which has less of the density that San Francisco does. So people experiencing homelessness shows up differently and sometimes in more intense ways in San Jose. And in this toolkit, which is sort of a guide for community engagement, we sort of explore different ways of thinking about safety that was very much in line with the national conversation around Black Lives Matter and rethinking community safety. Again, for Minneapolis, really close to a lot of these conversations. Something I would say, to your question of why other countries are different, there are different types of support structures in other countries that look out for people's well-being beyond just quote unquote public safety officers. And I'm not a specialist in public safety. I have not had the pleasure of collaborating with law enforcement, although that would be a very interesting project. But through our case study research related to this project that we did in San Jose, we did uncover some interesting tools for how to create a sense of public safety without deploying police. And I won't go through all of them, but again, if you go to Spur, it's a nonprofit in the Bay Area. They have a toolkit for coexistence. We did some interesting research with public library systems. I'll encourage you to observe what happens in your public libraries. These are public spaces that are open to everybody, where everybody has the right to be. And public libraries have gone through, I think, what people in the public, in places that are in public realms that have challenges with homelessness, public libraries have a lot to teach us because they've created rules and enforcement strategies that are respectful, but still create a sense of safety for everybody, especially with folks who are in crisis, experiencing homelessness, things like that. So there are tools out there for thinking differently about community safety beyond just using police. Obviously, it's a big national conversation. I agree that there's a design element of this. The example that I brought up around San Francisco Civic Center and Rittenhouse Square is another great example. If you contact me afterwards, I'm happy to give you some more references or look up this Spur report that has some thinking about the relationship between design, public space stewardship, and community safety with sort of dignity in mind. I can't answer your question about why other countries, quote unquote, do it better, but it's an interesting conversation. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and thank all of you for your thoughtful questions. If we can switch back over. All right, thanks, Mike. So you'll notice on your table that there are programs with QR codes on the back. One of them is to our event survey. Ask that you please do respond to that if you're able. We'll also be sending it out as a link in a follow-up email. But your responses to these surveys really impact the way that we put on our events. So please do take the time for that. I would also like to invite you to our follow-up conversation that will be happening a week from today on Zoom. We'll be featuring representatives from Bergman Associates, who are actually with us today. Hello, Bergman. They will be joining us on Zoom to unpack Anna's lecture from today and the entirety of the series as well, connecting all of the ideas and strategies back to our local context. And before we adjourn, I'd like to direct your attention to our next big event, the annual Reshaping Rochester Awards. The awards recognize exemplary regional initiatives and projects that positively impact people, neighborhoods, and the community. And the nomination period for our award for design and our award for activism open today. So you can head on over to cdcrochester.org/awards.html to review the nomination guidelines and submit an application. That nomination period is open through September, but we ask that you get your nominations in sooner rather than later. And with that, we are at the conclusion of our 2022 Reshaping Rochester Lecture Series. I thank you all for bearing with us during all of the webinars and Zoom meetings over the past couple of years. And so glad that you were here to relaunch our in-person activities. And in Muessig, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you all for your thoughtful questions, comments, etc. I hope that you all take care, be well, and that I'll see you next year. Thank you.